Our conversation today is part of a series organized by the Center of Law and Society at Cardiff University. And today we have a special guest, Emeritus Professor of Cardiff University, Phil Thomas, who has been working at Cardiff 36 years. He has always been connected with Cardiff, Wales, and the Journal of Law and Society, which he has always been editor-in-chief and the founding father of. Phil was very active not only in United Kingdom but all around the world. He spent time in the United States and in Africa in the 1960s doing the research there, having many contacts in continental Europe with regular travels to Asia, India, China, elsewhere. He has been a very busy man, and we are very honored to have him with us today to share his views of socio-legal studies, the journal, and legal education in general. Today I would like to start our dialogue or our conversation by asking you, how did it all start? Of course, with the journal, and what was that great moment when and with whom and how you decided to start something that's been so important to socio-legal studies here in UK and beyond?
Okay, I joined the university, which was at that stage known as University College Cardiff, in 1970. And as you mentioned, I had previously worked in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Dar es Salaam and in Lusaka, also at Yale and also at Michigan. So I was in 1970 one of the founding members of this law school. The professor was appointed and I was the second person to be appointed. So it was very much a blank piece of paper that we had to work on, to play with, to draw on. It doesn't mean to say that I always had control of the pencil. The head of school had a big black indelible ink pen, and I had a pencil. But nevertheless, I was able to draw upon it, and as a consequence, was able to help develop the profile of this institution, this law school. And part of that profile was for me to be seen to be doing something different from that which was both traditional, that which I had experienced as a student myself, and I saw that this was an opportunity to explore and hopefully create something which was different and would contribute in a different sort of way. But quite specifically, as the journal is concerned, we set it up in 1974. And the original members of the board were Zenon Bankowski, a legal philosopher, Jeff Munjam, a sociologist, David Myers, I think it's fair to say a doctrinal lawyer, Gareth Lewis, fresh out of Cambridge, and therefore with that sort of view and experience of law, and also a doctrinal lawyer. Myself, of course, having had various experiences in different institutions. I mean, for example, Dar es Salaam was a hotbed of radical socialism during the time of Julius Nyerere, and attracted a wide range of smart, sometimes hairy professors to experience a different cultural and political environment. But for me, coming back to Cardiff, I brought all that experience and baggage with me. And because I'm from here, I'm from Caerphilly, it was never an intention to leave. Opportunities have arisen to go elsewhere from time to time, but I've always considered then rejected them because this is my home and this is my commitment. So in '74 we set up the journal. You asked how did it begin? Okay. We have to really, I think have to go back into the 60s. The 60s was a very exciting decade for discontent and radicalism, not simply in the UK, particularly London, of course, LSE, but also in France and in certain parts of Western Europe, less so in Eastern Europe at the time.
We had our own 1968.
Exactly. But the 60s was a time of difference and radical thought and creative opportunities. And I certainly feel myself as being a child of the 60s. And much of that period I was in the UK as a student, but much of it also I was working overseas in non-traditional environments. And so it was a real exchange of experiences and opportunities of Black Africa, high-quality US legal institutions, radicalism in the UK, which was a cocktail of some power. And I feel that that was, for me, a very important period. And I was not alone in this, because the 60s and the early 70s was a time of growth of universities in the UK. Places like Warwick, Lancaster, Essex, what other universities would there have been? A number of basically greenfield sites were developed, and they wanted new staff, new teachers, new ideas. And so what emerged was a collection of young scholars who had different experiences of the 60s, and some of them had had different experiences by studying overseas. Mostly they had studied in the USA.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask,
Okay.
because I always thought of myself as the child of the 60s, but being born in 1967. I know how important this whole period was for academic and political life, and what you were just describing illustrates that. So there was always politics behind the journal. Not was it just an academic politics to transform academia, or was there a larger issue or institutional politics, or was there a larger attempt simply to change the legal science and law in practice?
I think it was a combination of these illustrations or points that you picked up. Personally, I had a doctrinal, formal education. All my teachers were from Oxford. They were all male, and they all sang off the same hymn sheet, which I found totally boring and unimpressive. But personally, my mission, I felt, was as political as it was as academic. I've always been a political animal, and by that I mean active in the political sphere. I could have as easily entered politics as an MP, and indeed I was approached to become an MP in Wales, which I decided I didn't want. I wanted to stay in academia. But politics have always been very much the rationale of what I'm doing at university and outside of university. This is, for me, not an ivory tower.
And you also mentioned the international dimensions, almost what we call today global dimension, but it's pretty obvious on the advisory board of the Journal of Law and Society, when you look back, that it's always been a very international body of scholars who were in regular contact. How important was all this, that you had academic contacts abroad? Yeah, I mean, not just British Commonwealth, but also continental Europe or United States.
I think it's easy to perhaps overemphasize the importance of an advisory board. When a new journal is seeking to make a name for itself, the first thing it does is to try and provide a list of the great and the good. And this is normally what happens with new journals. Journal of Law and Society was no different. I think it's interesting to remember that it began its life as the British Journal of Law and Society. And so in a sense, we were identifying ourselves within a particular community, within a particular language, and within a particular group of scholars, British. But because I had received an international exposure, educational amongst others, I always saw the importance of international contacts. But if one goes through the list of authors that we have published, certainly in the early years they were Brits. And it is in later years that we have consciously been able to expand our list of authors, not simply to common law jurisdictions and not simply to English language speaking countries, but to other jurisdictions which are from the civil law background or whose first language is not English. And I think the classic example for that would be a series of papers that we ran with Dutch scholars, and I was instrumental in working with Dutch scholars to bring the experiences of continental Europe and the civil law systems to the UK.
So it's a coincidence that research committee in sociology of law started working in 1968, that the executive board of Law and Society Association in the United States started also 1971, and the journal that was started here, it was coincidence which had international dimension, but it didn't have the international purpose from the very beginning, but it started growing up and transforming. When did the journal change the name from British?
We ran for about 3 or 4 years, okay. And then the publisher said the international bite of the journal will be more significant if you drop the name British. And so it was really a commercially driven decision. But I think it was the right decision, because we have become much more international, as you're well aware, as a result of changing the name. But just to go back to the LSA, I used to go off to the LSA conference on a very regular basis, and it was particularly strong around Wisconsin, and a number of people that I had actually worked with in Africa came from Wisconsin, and so I would go off to the LSA conferences on a regular basis, because the LSA conference is different from the UK equivalent, because it's much more interdisciplinary than the British equivalent. Yes, it has a hardcore of senior management who tend to be elite lawyers in the USA at the Ivy League law schools or the top 10 law schools. And then they have hundreds of members and hundreds of papers that come from a huge range of disciplines. So the LSA and its publication really developed rather differently from the British equivalent, which is totally dominated by lawyers.
Yes. Yes, yeah. So the journal also was quite important and instrumental for the development of SocioLegal Studies Association in the United Kingdom. So there was always a close link, but what you suggest is that you were always operating within much more legal science environment. Yeah? So could you go back to the history, to the early history of SocioLegal Studies Association and the journal.
Okay. In the early 70s, there was a group of us. We named ourselves the Socio-Legal Studies Group. We used to meet on an annual basis, usually in Sheffield or sometimes in Manchester, usually in the Easter vacation, and maybe 20 of us would turn up, something like that. They were all young males. We're now all old males. And we would talk and discuss and play a bit of stupid football and get drunk and mutually support each other, because we came from a whole range of universities. And in each of the universities that we came from, we were all in the minority. You know, you have to remember that in the 70s, doctrinal law was clearly dominant in the United Kingdom, clearly dominant. One could argue that it still is, but in the 70s it was unquestionably the dominant paradigm within legal education. And the people who turned up for the socio-legal group were not part of that. They didn't buy into that. And so we were very much outsiders on the margins of whatever was seen to be central and purposeful for legal education. So those meetings were ways in which we bonded, charged our batteries, and went back to what we were doing previously, feeling, well, you know, we're not stupid. We've got something to offer, and we are part of a community. And that's how it began, really, and that's how the journal began, out of that very exercise of, I think in 1973, we had a meeting, I think it was in Sheffield, and Colin Campbell, who later became Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham University, said from, I think it was from the chair, he said, we need to have a journal, you know, and I said yes, and I put my hand up and said yes, I'm in the process of setting one up, which is a rather strong statement, because I wasn't in the process, but I certainly was thinking of it, because I'd been involved in setting up a journal in Africa, so it wasn't entirely strange to me, but I really felt that if you want to encourage scholarship, you have to provide the scholar with a vehicle in which he or she can present that scholarship. And that, you know, the Law Quarterly Review or the Cambridge Law Journal were not appropriate vehicles for the sort of work that we wanted to do. They would simply turn the material down. So they needed to have their own vehicle in order to be able to present their thinking, their ideas and their scholarship.
It's interesting what you say about legal science and legal education in Britain in general, because unlike in other countries, there was no strong tradition of legal realism like in Scandinavia or United States, or strong legal theory in the continental sense. And so you were pushing into the territory which was really new. How different you were, for instance, from Modern Law Review at that time, which already had some reputation, and so you were looking for a different journal, different project, scholarly project. So was there any relationship, or was there?
Well, there was actually a relationship with the MLR, that I was in contact by correspondence with Otto Kahn-Freund, who then wrote to me and said that when in the 30s, when they came over from Germany, they wanted to set up the MLR as a radical, different, challenging vehicle for scholarship, and they set it up, but he didn't feel that they were totally successful in the enterprise, and that he said, what you are seeking to do is a fresh start, and I wish you well in achieving and the goal that you have spelt out to me. So, in a sense, there was something going on, and we tried to do something different, and we did. The whole idea, I think, of scholarship to me is pushing the boundaries, always pushing the boundaries. And for young academics, they're a bit like explorers, I think. An explorer doesn't necessarily do it because he has a well-paid job at home and a wife and 3 kids and a lovely house, and he doesn't want to leave the fireside. An explorer is someone who's willing to go out and do dangerous things, exciting things, with a view to some sort of advantage. It may be monetary. I think in what we're talking about was the idea of recognition of difference. And that if you are treading the same treadmill as a million other scholars, then how do you ever get recognized?
It's important what you say about legal science and pushing boundaries within legal academia and legal scholarship. But you also mentioned that in United States, Law and Society Association has always been a lot more interdisciplinary than here in the UK. Did you have any contacts with social science researchers or political scientists, or was there any contact between other scholars and other faculties and lawyers?
Well, the only contact I personally had, of course, was with sociology, through Jeff Munjam, who was a lecturer in the sociology department. And I used to write with Jeff, and it was fascinating, intriguing, and frustrating, because I would ask a set of questions that we were going to examine, and then he would say, those are not the right questions. Here's a different set of questions for you. And so I started to look at that literature. But I think that for lawyers, like so many so many disciplines, you build high walls around your discipline. They are difficult to either climb out of, because you're comfortable there, and even more difficult to climb into. So I remember reading a quote from the provost of Chicago University, who described Chicago University, its departments are a series of institutions collectively called but held together by a common heating system. That basically a discipline is very jealous in the way that a profession is very jealous of its entity, its control, its quality, its knowledge, its language, which you are very well aware of as a legal philosopher. That you could name names to me and they're just merely names.
And I particularly like that famous statement by Max Weber, who said, don't talk to me about field. I don't have a field. I'm not a donkey. And so is it in the sociologist's nature that you simply push the boundaries? You don't care about fields and fences. What you care is much more about seeing things from different perspectives. And I remember that the journal has always been a venue for different disciplines, what is today called interdisciplinarity, that horrible cliche of trans, multi, interdisciplinarities. But you have always been engaged in it, and in the 1980s you also closely collaborated with radical legal theory, critical legal theory that was emerging out of the 1970s movements. How important was this link?
I think that lawyers, and if you were to read the preface to the first issue of the JLS, which I wrote, I think on the back of an envelope, I talked about the importance of other disciplines, but that lawyers tend to see themselves inevitably and in their own perception correctly as dominant. and that if they are going to interact with another discipline, it is on the basis of master and servant. And I think lawyers are very good in terms of their playing the role of a cuckoo. They can pop into another discipline and expect to be fed, grow up, and then fly away again without recognizing the contribution of the feeder. And I think that lawyers have been able to get away with a lot by just popping over the wall or opening the gate and going into another discipline, take what they want, then go back again. I think one of the issues today, if I may, is the fact that other disciplines are operating on a parity with them and saying, well, no, if you want to do that sort of research, get your training, because one of the things we're really bad at is research training. And this has been highlighted by several commissions and discussions that we have around the editorial board, for example, about the importance of, if you're going to do empirical work and social policy work, then you need to be asking the right questions. You need to be able to understand what SPSS is all about and what a tower chart is and why a pie chart isn't very good. I'm talking as if I know a lot about this, which I don't. But we as lawyers are trained in a certain manner. I was, and you were. And it's very hard to break that mold. I think what we're seeing in the last 10 years is an emergence of a new breed of academic. And we're seeing it within the law school at the moment, which you've talked to me about. Young scholars coming in with different ideas, different perceptions, different training. When I graduated, when I came into this law school for many, many years, nobody had a PhD. Nobody needed a PhD. You can't get a job as an office cleaner today without a PhD. Right. So we're seeing a radical change in personnel, and that will impact upon scholarship and expectations and relationships with other disciplines.
Yeah, that's true. That this complete transformation of law as an academic discipline and the rise of lawyers and their political importance, their economic importance, and corresponding decline of some social sciences, in public policy shaping. And for me, coming from continental legal culture and continental legal education, I was always puzzled by the difference between socio-legal studies and sociology of law, because yes, even in some continental traditions, sociology of law is perceived mainly as a science bringing different methodology to law. You talked about cuckoo nest and lawyers behaving like cuckoos, that being fed by other methodology. But as you already stated, it has never been about methodology only. It was always driven by aims beyond academia. But going back to this labeling that socio-legal studies, ever since the beginning of, this is Journal of Law and Society, socio-legal studies rather than sociology of law. Is there any reason behind it?
Yeah, I will go on and say that when in our first meeting of the board, and we have the record, we have the minutes, we had a discussion about what to call the journal. And I wanted to call it the Journal of Law and Society. And Zen Bankowski said we should call it the Journal of Law in Society. And he was right. I was right on the day, but in the long term, he was right.
Yeah, absolutely, because it almost indicates like there is law and there is society, when actually every law operates in society. And but it happens to other movements in legal science, law and psychoanalysis, law and gender, and law and economics. So it seems like law wants to keep and preserve its autonomy even when it couples with other disciplines. And In the continent, obviously there is a tradition of sociology of law, which can be theoretical, comparative, and but here in UK in the last 10 years, we've been witnessing almost a renaissance of socio-legal studies, or quite strong growth of interdisciplinary studies of law, and scholars explore legal in socio-legal, social in socio-legal, comparative, anthropological in socio-legal. How important for you as a sociologist of law, as an editor of Journal of Law and Society, how important are these insights from continental sociology of law or international research committee in sociology of law? I know that there is quite busy communication between British and continental or American sociologists of law.
Let me give you the Times in the 30s, I think, they had a leader banner headline, "Europe cut off by fog from the United Kingdom."
Yes. Yes.
And in a sense, if you take that analogy in terms of the legal systems, legal thought, it is so radically different from Europe. Exactly. As you are a classic example of it. It's so radically different. We, in the 70s and 80s, we did not speak any language other than English. If you look around the faculty today, there are so many languages. It's like the Tower of Babel here, if you put them all together. We have people from so many different countries. People like yourself, who knows virtually nothing about the common law, but everything about civil law. You know, so we have, again, the idea of jurisdictional boundaries, which are historically so important because they reflect territorial sovereignty. That, as we now know, are about to test in June of this year, the idea of territorial sovereignty and jurisdictional sovereignty. But 25, 30 years ago, these were non-issues for academics. We did not speak French, we did not speak German, we didn't speak Czech, we didn't understand the civil law system, we didn't understand the jurisprudence of Europe, and perhaps most importantly, we didn't care. What we really cared, if we were going to do anything, was what was happening across the other side of the Atlantic. You know, and so a whole range of people started going over to America, because there was quality scholarship. If you got into a really good university, they all spoke English of a sort over there, and so that allowed us to communicate very effectively in a way that when you speak to European scholars, sometimes you have these baby conversations with them, and you feel you're not getting through to them, or vice versa. Yeah. Now that is changing. But historically, that was a huge barrier.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because my daughters, whenever we go back to Prague for summer holiday, they say, "Are we going to Europe?" And but what you're saying, what you're indicating, is that the transformation of legal system, of the British, I should say, of the legal system of England and Wales, but in general law in the UK and in Europe, further steers a new legal education and completely transformed legal academia, and you see socio-legal studies as important element in comprehending this transformation. Yeah.
For example, when we started off, I wrote a paper probably 25 years ago, and I talked about socio-legal studies as being the other, the oppositional, the alternative, so that in a way in which a plane and a bird takes off into the prevailing wind, socio-legal studies took off into doctrinal law. The prevailing paradigm was doctrinal law. So socio-legal studies was an alternative, an oppositional, and other to it. And that, in the 21st century, where I believe we now are, is changing. We are now seeing conferences of 400 people. We are seeing people who are very senior people wanting to get into the Journal of Law and Society, and other journals which are following suit. The International Journal of Law in Context, Social and Legal Studies. Even the MLR itself. I see papers in the MLR which could as easily have been published by us.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a growth of opportunity, and opportunity creates interest.
Mm-hmm. And socio-legal studies as providing conceptual framework for understanding and analyzing supranational, transnational legal orders such as European law, and
hopefully so. I mean, I think one of the dangers of socio-legal studies is that its life as an alternative was very clear, but now its life as in its own right is less easily defined. Mm-hmm. You know, that I can hear papers being delivered in the SLSA conference, for example, which could as easily fit and as well recognized in the Conference of Society of Legal Scholars. You know, sometimes I feel that the bite that I was hoping to get even more vicious within socio-legal studies is less dramatic. You know, I see less critical studies, I see less nastiness in it by saying, surely that's what we're supposed to be. We're meant to be critical as academics. And some of the stuff is a form of social policy which is perhaps promotional rather than aggressively critical.
It's interesting because what you're saying is almost like the double role of socio-legal studies, which sociology always it was established as a science of governing and governance rather than science of critique, and ever since the 19th century it struggles between criticism and endorsement of certain politics or policies, but there's also critical legal studies in the United Kingdom, but critical legal studies was always defined by the postmodern turn, so it was very different from the United States, for instance, and one wonders about this overlap in critical role of socio-legal studies and critical role of legal theory or even legal political philosophy and psychoanalysis, whether there would be already too much critique in legal academia. Or
well, I don't believe you're going to have too much critique.
Yes. Yeah.
I really think that is the role of the academic, to be a freestanding critic. Mm-hmm. How else does society ever develop and improve if we don't have people like me around who are saying the wrong things to the right people?
Yeah. So like Karl Mannheim's ideal of free-floating intellectuals criticizing and bringing ideas into different sciences, including legal science. But there's one big elephant in the room which we didn't mention, which is economy and economics. And we mentioned that there's law in society, there's law in psychoanalysis, but there's also law and economy. How important has been this economic analysis of law for the Journal of Law and Society in particular, but for socio-legal studies in general? Well, was there a competition in UK, like in the United States? There is certain tension, or?
Well, in the States, of course, that's relatively new.
Yes.
The Law and Society Association never had any real issue about economics because the economists seldom went there. And I think in the UK, economics has extensively and importantly been located in business schools, so that if you're doing a degree in economics, it's going to be economics and finance, economics and HR, so, you know, economics and something with a business practical relationship. And I just don't know, I've never seen the takeoff of law and economics in this country. There have been, you know, Anthony Ogus was in Manchester, was very big on law and economics, and he wrote in the JLS on law and economics. The Oxford Centre had an economist or two economists based there. But reality, we have not, I'm unaware of any journal which is carrying law and economics as papers. We have done hardly anything in that area, simply because, like any other journal, you can by and large only publish what you are given. If we could all have a wish list, then we'd have a very different journal, I think. You know, if the material doesn't come in and of an appropriate quality, it's very hard to put together a journal where you would say, yes, we want some really classy stuff on law and psychology, and we want something on law economics and macroeconomics and microeconomics, because that would explain so much to our readers and make it a more interesting journal to read. But the fact is, if the material's not there, then you've got blank pages.
But it's surprising. It's almost like a blind spot at the times of economic globalization and economic trends which go unregulated, or those shady spaces of economic constitutionalism, which actually hates official legal rules. It wants to be self-regulated rather than legally regulated. There's something missing then in socio-legal studies, and who is exploring economic in socio-legal when it's missing there?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And going back to socio-legal studies, it is very different today from what it was in the 70s that you describe, or 1980s, and would you describe it as a broad church, or is there still some very specific mission that?
Well, I think it's a broad church. I think it's a Catholic church in that sense. That, you know, that we accept all types and activities and purposes. I'm not even sure now whether you can describe it as a purely left, politically motivated process. I suspect that people as academics are rather different from some of the academics I knew when I was a young man, where we chose not to go into practice. Some of us, like myself, had a brief time in practice, and people here of my age had a brief flirtation with practice and then came out again. I think that there is a different spirit today amongst some of the younger staff, the newer people, which is very much more about personal progress rather than progressing the discipline or the community or the society. That, you know, I think society has become much more individualistic and greedy. And that therefore self-promotion becomes a major feature if you're going to climb the greasy pole, and that always doesn't always work if you are thinking and talking in terms of community and policy and nation building in an appropriate sense. I mean, for example, I remember when E.P. Thompson was talking. And we carried an article about Warwick University Limited, but in something that he wrote, he said, I went looking as a social historian for law, and I saw it here, I saw it there, I saw it every bloody where. And that is something that we as lawyers both like and sometimes feel concerned about, the idea of the dominance of law in our society, which you mentioned earlier on. I mean, how law and the legal profession and lawyers in Parliament, and how regulation by law rather than regulation by other forces has become such an important, dominant way in which our society operates.
There is an interesting paradox almost, that we are in increasingly individualized societies, nevertheless increasingly more regulated societies. And universities are part of this trend, and I remember my profound shock when I heard one minister describing British universities as a successful industry. And I thought, well, isn't it time to leave? Because if we are turned into an industry, then we might end up as saying, and thank you for shopping in Sainsbury's, so thank you for studying at Cardiff, Warwick, Bristol University. This transformation of relationship between teachers and students into consumer relationship. This is something which I find profoundly worrying. And my last question, therefore, is if there is science as vocation, if there is socio-legal studies as vocation, what is this professional vocation for us? What is this mission, and does it have any particular ethics?
Well, I do think that socio-legal studies as a vocation, I see it as, at one stage I thought it was a new paradigm, but sometimes I also see it as a methodology. It's a way of approaching something rather than being something. And if it is the way of understanding the world in which we live in a better and a clearer way, then I think that that has a real purpose, because I think that the university is not about making widgets. It's not about having a vice-chancellor who's called a CEO. It's not about having students who are called clients. You know? I mean, I think that, you know, Renaissance education had a lot to speak for itself and very attractive. You know, we're not in an industry, but we happen to be in a supposed industry, which is what, the fourth or fifth biggest income generator in the British economy. It's called overseas students, people coming in to be educated, but educated for what purpose? It is the dilemma actually that law schools have faced for generations. About what are we here for? Are we here to produce lawyers? By that I mean people who are going to practice in the profession, or are we here to provide people who've had a liberal education? I think for me it's the latter, who have gone through the treadmill of law, which is a difficult one, challenging, and it encourages a tidy mind, an inquisitive mind, a mind which is capable of analyzing and criminalizing and synthesizing difficult situations. Now, that for me is an end product in itself. I don't think they need to know about how to draft a will in order to get through this degree program. I think liberal education is really the principal function, if not the sole function, of a law school. But of course, there will be people at the other end of the spectrum who will say that's nonsense. The job of the law school is to produce people who will be very good practitioners. And there are some law schools that do that, and they do it rather well. I think Cardiff is at the other end of the spectrum, or at least very much towards the other end of the spectrum, where a quality liberal education is something that we value and something that Cardiff seeks to offer to those students who are willing to accept it. And I think that's a very exciting place where we are, and perhaps a good place to stop.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Phil. All this is to be continued at other discussions here and elsewhere, and under the auspices of the Center of Law and Society and Journal of Law and Society. Thank you very much.
I would like just to say that this is a very important time. March 2016, it's the beginning of the opening of the Centre of Law and Society at Cardiff Law School, This is a very big event, and I wish you as director and all that you do over the coming years the very best for a successful future.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you. All the best.